The private dining room at Astor had gone quiet the way rooms do before something breaks. Julia Sterling sat at the head of the table, the German delegation across from her, the interpreter's voice sliding between them. A waiter leaned in to refill her water. His hand stopped over the glass. He had heard the sentence in German and heard what the interpreter made of it in English, and the two did not match. He bent close to her ear, low enough that only she could hear it. "Your translator is lying." Halvorsen went white. Renner's fingers tightened on his glass. Anna Falk looked up. Nobody moved. Blake Renner recovered first, because men like Renner always did. He laughed, a short professional sound, and spread his hands toward the delegation as if apologizing for bad weather. "I am so sorry," he said. "The staff here will have someone else brought in." The waiter had already straightened. He was tall, unhurried, somewhere past 40, a few days of stubble on his jaw and a stillness about him that did not belong to a man carrying a water pitcher. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply looked at Halvorsen, and Halvorsen looked at the tablecloth. Julia said nothing yet. She was watching that instead. She had built a fortune by noticing which people could not hold her eye, and the interpreter could not hold anyone's. Eric Halvorsen resumed as if nothing had happened. He turned to Werner Falk's granddaughter and delivered the next passage, and Anna answered in careful German, and Halvorsen rendered it for the table. "Miss Falk says the family remains concerned that Halden does not truly value the craftsmanship, that the price reflects a lack of respect." Julia lifted one finger, barely, off the linen. "Wait," she said. The word landed in the room like a dropped coin. She turned in her seat, found the waiter still clearing the far end of the table, and spoke without raising her voice. "You." What did she actually say? The room resented it. Renner started to object, a hand already rising. She did not look at him. The waiter came back to her side. He glanced once at Anna, a small, courteous glance. Permission asked and quietly granted between two people who understood one another. "She said the family is grateful you came in person," he said. She asked whether the intellectual property warranty could be structured so her grandfather's name stays on the process. Nothing about respect, nothing about price. Julia reached for the handwritten term sheet the Falks had brought, the one no one at her end of the table had bothered to translate, and ran her finger down the German. She did not read the language, but she could count clauses, and she could find the one word she now recognized from the waiter's mouth, and could not find it anywhere in Halvorsen's version. The numbers did not match. The man with the water pitcher matched. The dinner did not survive it. Anna gathered the papers with the careful economy of a woman who had decided she was being handled. Werner, 70 and silent at the far end, rose, buttoned his coat, and gave Julia a small, formal nod that meant the evening was over, and possibly a great deal more than the evening. The delegation left with the wounded dignity of people who believed they had been insulted and did not yet know by whom. Renner was already talking, low and fast, about damage control and getting ahead of the story. Julia was not listening. She was looking at the swinging door the waiter had disappeared through, thinking that a man did not correct a room like that unless he had once owned rooms like that. "Get me his name," she said. Across town, in a narrow house on the south side, that same man knelt at the edge of a small bed. His daughter Hazel, 8 years old, was fighting sleep the way she fought most things, on principle. "Say the word," she mumbled. He brushed the hair off her forehead and said it the way her mother used to say it, soft and unhurried, a word that had no home in English. "Geborgenheit. What's it mean again?" "Safe," he said. "Held. Home. All of it at the same time." She was asleep before he finished. He stayed a while in the dark, listening to her breathe, and then rose and went downstairs to wash the smell of the restaurant off his hands. Julia Sterling did not sleep at all that night. By 10 the next morning she had a name and a file, and neither one of them made sense. The waiter was Adam Whitaker, 40 years old, 6 months at Astor, exemplary and forgettable. That was the surface. Underneath the surface was something that made her set the paper down and read it a second time, to be sure the words hadn't rearranged themselves. Adam Whitaker had spent 9 years in the United States Foreign Commercial Service, Munich Station, a commercial attaché, the kind of man his government sent to keep a deal breathing when it mattered to more than one country. And there, folded into a footnote near the end of his record, was the thing that made her stomach drop out from under her. In 2015, when a foreign holding company had moved to strip Falk Precision of its patents and dissolve the rest, it was Whitaker who had built the arrangement that kept the firm in the family. The old man who had buttoned his coat and walked out of her dinner owed his entire company to the waiter who had refilled her water. The file was careful to note that Whitaker had done it almost entirely at arm's length. The work had run through the firm's lawyers and a chain of back channels in Munich. The attaché had never once sat across a table from Werner Falk himself. The old man had been saved by a name and a signature, not a face. Julia read the note twice and filed it away without yet knowing why it mattered. She found Adam at the end of his shift, unfolding chairs onto empty tables, the dining room dim and smelling of candle smoke. He did not seem surprised to see her. "You looked me up," he said, not turning around. "You saved that firm. A long time ago." He kept stacking chairs, the legs clacking softly. "I don't do that work anymore. You still speak the language. Languages don't leave." He set the last chair down and finally faced her. In the low light he looked both older and, somehow, more like the man in the file, as if the years had thinned away everything but the essential shape of him. "What do you want, Miss Sterling?" "I want to understand why the man who saved Falk Precision is stacking chairs at 11 o'clock at night." Something closed in his face, gently, the way a door closes when a man does not want you to hear the latch catch. "Because that's the job I have," he said. "Good night." She let him go. There was nothing else to do. But she stood alone in the empty restaurant a while longer, turning it over the way she turned over a bad quarter, looking for the number that had been changed. A man like that did not simply fall. Men like that were pushed. She had pushed enough of them herself to know the difference. She was still turning it over when her phone lit with Francis Deering's name. Francis had been Halden's general counsel for 19 years, long enough to know which questions got you thanked and which got you frozen out, and she had been quietly asking one of the second kind. "The interpreter," Francis said. "Halvorsen. I pulled the engagement records this afternoon. He didn't come through procurement. He didn't come through the deal team." A pause on the line, carefully weighted. Blake retained him directly. "Off the standard vendor list, off the approvals. I only found it because I went looking, and I only went looking because something about that dinner smelled wrong." Julia stood very still in the dark restaurant, the candle smoke settling around her. "Say that again," she said, slowly. She came back to Astor 2 nights later, after closing, and this time she did not come as a client. "I need you at the table," she said, as the interpreter. Adam wiped down the bar and did not look up. "No, the deal is worth $6 million. The deal is worth nothing if the man across from you believes you spit on his life's work." He set the rag down and finally met her eyes. "But that isn't my problem anymore. I translate for people who are polite to me and tip on the total. That's the whole of the ambition now. That's not true, and we both know it. You don't know anything about me. It came out flat, without heat, which was worse than anger would have been. You read a file. A file is just a list of things a person used to be." She heard the used to be, and understood that she had walked to the edge of a grief whose shape she couldn't see. She had come in, ready to argue leverage, and leverage was suddenly the wrong tool entirely. A wrench held out to a man who needed a different thing. She let the silence sit a moment, and in the silence she actually looked, at the room around him, the polished glasses, the folded napkins, the small, careful order a man builds around himself when the large order of his life has come apart. Then she changed her line of approach. "Werner Falk," she said. "You kept his company alive when a stranger tried to take it. Now a man in my building is using a paid liar to make him believe I hold him in contempt. He's going to fly home to Bavaria believing it. You can let that stand, Adam, or you can sit at a table and let him hear what people are actually saying to him for once." For the first time, Adam looked at her, and looked. It was not the argument that moved him, and she knew it, and had the sense to let it be. It was the name. It was Werner. She could see the old man cross his face like a debt. A small sound came from the hallway behind the bar. Hazel, in socks and a sweatshirt several sizes too big, had come down looking for water and stopped short when she saw a stranger at the bar. Adam crossed to her without a word, crouched to her height, murmured something too low to hear, and steered her back toward the stairs with a hand on her shoulder that was the gentlest thing in the room. Hazel went, but not before turning at the foot of the stairs to give Julia a long, frank, unembarrassed inspection, the kind only children and very old men are still allowed. Then she padded up into the dark. When he came back, he was different. Some hardness had gone out of him and not returned. Julia had watched the whole small exchange and understood that she had just seen the actual man, the one the file could not hold and the apron could not hide, and that he was worth 10 of the version he'd been pretending to be for 6 months of quiet shifts. "One condition," he said. "I translate. That's all. I don't advise. I don't negotiate. I don't get pulled back into any of it. When it's done, I'm done, and you don't come looking for me again. Understood?" He nodded once, and Julia caught in the set of his shoulders the shape of the man the file had described, straightening up under a weight he had sworn to himself he had put down for good. The re-engagement dinner was held in a smaller room. No linen, no theater, just a round table and a pot of coffee going cold in the corner. Adam sat at Julia's left with a legal pad and rendered every sentence exactly, in both directions, and something the negotiation had been missing for 3 weeks quietly slid back into place. The truth, he gave Anna Falk her actual words back, that the family did not care about the last $100,000, that what they could not accept was a contract letting Halden strip Werner's name off the process he had spent 50 years perfecting. It was not a money problem. It had never once been a money problem. Halverson had built it into one, in both languages at the same time, feeding each side a steady diet of the other's imagined insults, until 2 parties, who would have shaken hands in an afternoon, could barely sit in the same room. There was a moment, an hour in, when the whole thing balanced on a single word. Anna used a German term for craftsmanship that carried a second meaning underneath it, closer to stewardship, to holding a thing in trust for the people who came after. Halverson, 3 weeks earlier, had flattened it to a demand for money. Adam did not flatten it. He gave the room both meanings, the surface and the thing beneath, and Julia heard, for the first time, what the family had actually been asking for all along, and answered the real question instead of the invented one. Anna blinked and looked at Adam, and then looked at Julia differently. Adam translated Julia's answer without softening it or sharpening it, and for the first time Anna's shoulders came down from around her ears. Werner joined by video from a laptop propped on a spare chair, his face grave in the small bright rectangle, and he listened and said very little, and at the very end he asked a single quiet question about the warranty language that told everyone in the room the door had opened again. Once, between passages, Julia caught Adam's eye across the corner of the table. She did not smile. Neither did he, but something passed between them in the half-second before he turned back to Anna, an acknowledgement, quick and private, that they were building this together and that they both knew it. It was the closest thing to a conversation they had that entire evening, and it said more than the 2 hours of talking around it. Renner smiled through all of it. He smiled the particular way a man smiles when he is recalculating in his head and does not want it to show on his face. Afterward, in the concrete quiet of the parking garage, Julia and Adam stood by her car, and neither of them moved to end it. "You could have negotiated circles around every person in that room," she said. "I said I wouldn't. You wanted to, I watched you not do it. That's a different thing." He didn't deny it. He looked out at the sodium lights and the oil stains and the low hum of the ventilation and said, "The board's watching this one closely, aren't they? It's not really about the 6 million. She was quiet for a moment. Nobody in her company would have dared read her that plainly to her face. "No," she admitted. "It's not about the 6 million. He nodded, as if that confirmed something he had already been carrying, and reached past her and opened her car door. The gesture was so ordinary, so entirely without calculation, that it took her a full block of driving before she noticed how long it had been since anyone had done it for her and how much she had let herself forget she missed it. Renner moved the next day. He did it the way careful men do damage, in memos and side conversations, never once in the open. He raised, with grave concern, the matter of the waiter. A former federal official, pushed out of government under a cloud, now brought inside a live negotiation with the very German firm his old career had been tangled up in. Was that not, Renner asked the executive committee, a conflict of interest? Was Miss Sterling letting a personal fascination cloud a decision she owed her shareholders? He requested the signing be accelerated. "Get it done this week," he argued, "before the process leaks and the counterparty grows skittish." It sounded like prudence. It was a countdown, and he was the only one holding the clock. Frances tried to slow it, and found herself outside the door of the meeting where it was decided. Someone had quietly narrowed the circle. Her access to the deal file had been reclassified overnight, downgraded on a technicality nobody would defend but nobody would reverse. She called Julia and said, in the flat voice of a lawyer who knows how she is being managed, "I can't help you from where he's put me. He's not fighting the deal. He's fighting your judgment, and he's winning the part that happens in hallways." Julia came to Astor near midnight, because there was nowhere else the truth seemed willing to live anymore. "He's using you against me," she said. "Your record. He's turning the best thing about you into the reason I can't trust my own eyes." Adam poured 2 coffees no one had asked for and slid one across the bar toward her. "That's what they do," he said. "It's exactly what they did to me. You don't lose those jobs to a scandal. You lose them to a story someone else got to tell first, in a room you weren't standing in. What was your story?" He turned his cup a slow quarter turn on the wood. For a long moment she was certain he wouldn't answer. "A deal went down in 2019. A big one. It fell apart, the way big things do, for 100 reasons, and no single one. And afterward, somebody had to be the reason. I was the one who wasn't in the room to argue when they picked." He said it evenly, without a scrap of self-pity, which made it land twice as hard. "I resigned before they could turn it into a headline. Then Miriam got sick. By the time that was finished, I didn't have anything left in me to defend anymore. Miriam." He said the name and set it carefully down on the bar between them, like something that might not survive being handled. Julia did not reach for it. She understood, without being told, that the right thing was to let it sit there in the space between them and not touch it with a single word. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant only that, and nothing more, and he could hear that she meant only that. He nodded. Something between them had shifted weight in the dark. It was not comfort, exactly. It was the beginning of trust, which is a heavier thing to carry and a harder one to set down. As she left, she passed a young woman waiting in the vestibule, a coat over her arm, watching the street for a car. Katrin Bauer, the second interpreter from the dinners, the one who sat behind Halverson and never once spoke. She looked at Adam through the glass with an expression Julia couldn't quite name, something caught between fear and a decision not yet made, and she opened her mouth as if to say a thing she had been carrying too long. Then the car pulled up to the curb, and its headlights swept the glass, and she was gone. Katrin came to the restaurant 3 days later, alone, an hour before it opened, when the chairs were still upside down on the tables. She spoke to Adam in German, quickly, the words tumbling out of a person who had held them behind her teeth too long. She had sat second chair through every session, standard practice. The junior interpreter keeps a running log, time-stamped and verbatim, as a check on the room. She had noticed the drift inside the first hour, a warmth turned cool, a compliment turned complaint. By the second session she had understood, with a sick certainty, that she was watching a man mistranslate on purpose. She had said nothing, because Halvorsen had hired her, and an interpreter who accuses another interpreter does not work in the city again. But she had kept the log, every line of it. And there was more. The sessions were recorded, she said, still in German, so that only he would understand until he chose otherwise. For the file, standard, for a deal this size. The audio still exists. Nobody has thought to delete it, because nobody thinks anyone will ever check the interpreter against the tape. Adam went very still. The last chair he'd been reaching for stayed where it was. They laid it out on the bar that night, the three of them and Francis on speaker, Katrin's time-stamped log, the raw German on the recording, and Adam translating the true meaning of it in real time, while Francis matched each falsehood to the exact moment it had been spoken aloud. It was not subtle, once you could see it. Halvorsen had systematically inverted the deal. Every German concession had become an American insult. Every American courtesy had become a German demand. He had spent 3 weeks building a wall of manufactured contempt between two parties who, left alone, would have come to terms before dessert. And the log did one thing more. It showed the pattern was too clean to be error. Nobody drifts this consistently. Somebody had told him what outcome to produce. Francis pulled the payment thread. Halvorsen's fee had not come out of the deal budget at all. It had come through a consulting shell, and the shell traced back toward Corveth Capital, the rival that had been circling Falk Precision for a year, and Corveth traced back toward the very man who had hired the interpreter in the first place. Adam sat back on his stool. For a moment he was not a waiter at all. He was the man from the file, reading a room that wasn't there, seeing the whole architecture of the thing standing up in the air in front of him. He doesn't want your deal to fail, Adam said slowly. He wants it to die ugly. He wants Falk to walk, Corveth to catch them on the way out, and you to be remembered as the executive who lost a firm the board was counting on. All three at once, from a single lie, told twice. And I hand him the whole company on my way out the door, Julia finished. The bar was quiet. Somewhere the ice machine dropped a load with a sound like distant applause. Adam looked down at the log, at Werner's real words rendered faithfully at last, and something settled in him that had been unsettled for 4 years. This was not about Renner. It was not even about Julia. It was about an old man who deserved to hear what people were actually saying to him. "All right," he said, and it carried far more than the 2 words. "Let's give it back to him. The truth. All of it. In the right language this time." Her hand was on the bar. His was near it. Neither of them moved the last 2 inches, and both of them saw the distance, and both of them let it stand. They had 4 days, and a single hard problem. The proof a board would accept had to be assembled without Renner ever learning it existed. Francis did the reconstruction from the outside he'd exiled her to, which turned out to be its own kind of cover, since a woman locked out of the file was the last person he expected to be building one. She rebuilt the engagement trail, the shell company, the timeline of payments that lined up too neatly with every move Corveth had made all year. She worked from home, on paper, leaving no trail in the systems he could watch. Katrin, frightened but steady, signed a sworn statement authenticating her log and agreed to walk the board through it, line by line, timestamp by timestamp, knowing exactly what it would cost her if she was wrong and what it would cost her career even if she was right. Adam prepared a clean parallel translation of the recorded sessions, the lie and the truth set in 2 columns down the page, so that anyone in the room, in any language, could lay a finger on the theft and follow it with their own eyes. Renner smelled something before he could name it. He pushed the signing to Friday and dressed it up as rescue. "Sign now," he told the committee, gravely, "or watch the entire thing come apart in the trade press by Monday." He had Julia boxed and he knew it. Sign, and she'd be ratifying a poisoned deal on Corveth's timeline before the fraud was proven. Refuse, and he'd tell the board she had frozen under pressure and cost them a firm they'd promised their investors. There was one piece he could not control, and it was the one that mattered most. Werner Falk had to still be at the table on Friday, and Werner, insulted and quietly furious, was one bad phone call away from flying home to Bavaria for good. Adam made the call himself, not as an interpreter, as the man who had saved the old man's company 11 years before. He spoke to Werner in German for 40 minutes, and Julia, who understood not one word of it, understood all of it from the sound alone. The deference in it, the plain honesty, the refusal to promise anything at all except that on Friday the old man would finally hear the truth spoken in a room where no one alive could bend it. Werner agreed to stay. 48 more hours. That was all he would give, and it was exactly enough. When Adam set the phone down, Julia was watching him with something she was no longer bothering to hide. "You told him you'd protect his name," she said. "I told him nobody was going to steal it while I was standing in the room," Adam said. "That's a different promise. It's one I can actually keep." They worked past 2 in the morning. When she finally stood to leave, she swayed a little, running on nothing, and he was there at her elbow before she'd finished the motion, steadying her, opening the door, angling himself between her and the wind coming hard off the street without appearing to decide to do any of it. It was nothing. It was the whole thing. She had spent her entire life being the person who protected the room, and for one block of cold sidewalk she let herself be. For once, the room someone else was protecting. Neither of them had a word for it. There was one, in another language, and the only person in the city who knew it did not say it out loud. The board convened Friday in the glass room on the 40th floor, and Blake Renner walked in believing he had already won. He had his memo, he had his narrative, polished over a week of hallways. He rose to recommend the accelerated signing, and to note, with visible reluctance, his lingering concerns about certain outside influences on Miss Sterling's judgment. Julia let him finish every word of it. Then she asked Francis to bring in the record. It came apart for Renner slowly, and then all at once. Katrin walked the board through her log, timestamp by patient timestamp, her voice steadying as she went. Adam played the recordings and read the 2 columns aloud. The German truth and the English lie side by side, and laid them next to each other until the pattern was undeniable to every person at the table. Francis set the payment trail down in front of them, the shell, the fee, the line running from Halvorson's mistranslations straight to Corveth Capital and back to the man who had hired him without telling anyone he'd done it. Halvorson was not there to defend himself. Renner tried. He reached first for procedure, then for character, then for the old smear about the waiter, and each one came apart in his hands, because the 2 columns on the screen did not care who Adam Whitaker had once been. They only showed what had been said and what had been claimed, over and over, in Renner's own vendor's voice. He heard his own voice climbing toward the ceiling, and stopped when he understood that the climbing was the sound of a man who had already lost the room. Adam did not gloat. He closed the laptop when it was done and stepped back to the wall, out of the light, the way a man steps back when the work is finished. Julia watched him do it, and marked it. The board removed him before the day was over and referred the matter for outside review, tortious interference, and a good deal worse. He walked out of the glass room carrying nothing at all, which was fitting, because he had walked in intending to leave with everything. And then Werner Falk arrived. The old man had asked to be present for the end of it. He crossed the room slowly, Anna a step behind him, and stopped in front of the interpreter who had refilled a water glass 10 days before. He did not know the face. In 11 years he had never once seen it. But when Julia thanked Adam Whitaker by his full name for what he had done, the old man went very still, and then his own face changed, the way a face changes when a name carried a long time finally finds the person it belongs to. He took Adam by the shoulders and held him at arm's length, matching a decade of gratitude to a stranger who had turned out not to be a stranger at all. "Attaché Whitaker," he said, in careful English, for the whole room to hear. "All these years I had only your name, and you are still saving my company." He took Adam's hand in both of his and held it. It was not a large gesture. For a man like Werner, it was everything he had. The deal was signed that afternoon, $6 million, the old man's name protected in every clause that mattered. Julia stood at the head of the same table where, 10 days earlier, a stranger had leaned in to tell her the truth, and she signed, and the board that had spent a month watching her saw exactly what it needed to see. As the room emptied, Werner drew Adam aside and asked him something, very quietly, in German, that Julia was not meant to hear. Whatever it was, Adam did not answer it right away. The aftermath was quieter than the fight, the way it almost always is. Corveth withdrew its interest in Falk Precision inside of a week. There was no ugly story left to catch, and no dying firm to catch it with. Renner's name came off the building directory without ceremony, prized off the lobby wall by a maintenance crew while people walked past not noticing. The outside review would grind on for months, but that was for the lawyers now, and Julia found she could think about it for whole hours at a time without any heat at all, which was its own kind of proof that the thing was over. Frances got her access back, and a good deal more standing than she'd had before she lost it. The woman who had built the case from a kitchen table was not someone anyone at Halden would lock out of a room again. Katrin Bauer, who had staked her whole career on a log nobody had asked her to keep, left Halden with a letter from Julia that would open any door in the industry. She had walked into the fight expecting to lose everything for telling the truth, and walked out of it holding more than she came in with, which does not happen often enough to be believed when it does. And Adam Whitaker folded his apron, hung it on its hook at Astor, and prepared to go back to being the man with the water pitcher, as if the last 10 days had happened to some other man entirely, and he'd only heard the story second-hand. He was good at that, at stepping back into the smaller life. He'd had 4 years of practice. He told himself it was relief, and almost believed it, right up until the moment the belief was tested. Julia found him before he could disappear into it. She did not come with an offer. She had thought, the whole drive over, about all the roles she could invent for a man like him, all the titles and the salaries, and she'd understood somewhere on the stairs up to the dining room that every one of them would be another way of putting him back inside a file. He had already spent 4 years being a list of things he used to be. She was not going to hand him another list, so she came with nothing but the truth, which by now was the only currency that had ever passed between them. "I'm not here to hire you," she said. "No? No." She stood in the empty restaurant with her hands pushed into her coat pockets, and for once looked less like a woman who owned things and more like a woman who wanted one. "I came to ask if you'd have dinner. No table, no papers, no one to translate for. Just dinner." Adam looked at her a long moment. The professional armor was gone from both of them now, worn off in the same fight, and what was left underneath was 2 people who had learned each other in the worst possible conditions and discovered, to their mutual inconvenience, that they liked a great deal of what they'd learned. "There's a condition this time, too," he said. "Of course there is. You'll have to meet Hazel first," he said. "She's the one who decides these things. I just work here." Something eased in Julia's face that she didn't bother to control. A package came for Adam that same week, from Bavaria, wrapped in brown paper and more string than it needed. Inside was a small brass instrument, a machinist's gauge, old and perfectly kept, engraved with Werner's initials, and a date from before Adam was born. There was no note. None was needed. Some things did not require translation in any language, and both of the men involved had always known it. The dinner was at Adam's narrow house on the south side, and it was not elegant in the least, and that was precisely the point of it. Hazel had appointed herself the authority for the evening. She interrogated Julia thoroughly over macaroni about her favorite animal, her firm position on whether cereal counted as a soup, and whether she could, on the whole, be trusted with important matters. Julia answered every question with the same grave seriousness she'd normally reserve for a hostile board, and, after a long deliberating pause, passed. Adam moved around the small kitchen in a way Julia had not seen from him before, easy and unguarded, a dish towel over one shoulder, and she found she liked watching it more than she had liked watching anything in a long time. He was not performing competence for anyone. He was simply making his daughter dinner, and there was a whole man in that, more than there had been in any boardroom. Twice their hands crossed, reaching for the same thing, and twice neither of them made anything of it, and both times they noticed. Later, when Hazel had been carried up to bed, and the house had gone soft and low and quiet, the girl called down the stairs for the word, the way she did every single night of her life. Adam looked at Julia, an invitation with no weight on it at all, and she followed him up the narrow stairs. At the edge of the small bed, Hazel considered Julia for a moment, and then decided to share the most important thing she owned. "There's a word," she whispered, "that Daddy says. It's not in English. It means safe and held and home, all at the very same time." She yawned enormously. "You have to say it exactly right or it doesn't work." "Teach me," Julia said, and the girl said it, and Julia said it back, clumsy on the unfamiliar shape of it. And the girl frowned and corrected her, and made her do it again, and again, until at last it came out right. Hazel nodded once, satisfied. An examiner passing a candidate, and was asleep almost before her head found the pillow. Adam stood in the doorway and watched the two of them shape a word between them that he had carried entirely alone for years, and he did not say anything, because there was nothing at all that needed saying. He thought, standing there, of all the rooms he had stood in for other people, carrying their meanings back and forth across tables while his own life went untranslated in a language nobody was listening for. He had been good at it. He had been the best in the building at giving strangers exactly what they meant to say. It had taken him 4 years and a woman he'd tried to send away to notice that he had never once done it for himself. When the light was off and the house had gone quiet, he and Julia stood a moment together in the narrow hall. She turned to face him. Neither of them reached for a word, because the only right one belonged to a girl asleep down the hall, and because some things do not need to be said in order to be true. He did not close the distance, and neither did she. And then, without either of them deciding it, the last 2 inches simply were not there anymore, and her hand was flat against his chest, and his was over hers, and they stood like that in the dark, not speaking, not needing to. He had spent his whole life carrying other people's words across the distance between them. For the first time in years, the meaning he was keeping safe was his own.